There's no doubt that pyromancies are strong in Dark Souls, but they're probably even stronger than you think. We've explored increasing their potency with spell swap, and touched the surface of animation swapping. However, now's the time to explore even deeper, to discover the nearly endless tempest we can conjure. Our journey starts a fair way into a run, beating through new game cycles any way we see fit to gain access to New Game Plus 11. Why? Well, first because it was fun, though the more relevant answer is that it allows us to stack up on Fire Tempest casts. With the 10 attunement slots from leveling, 1 from the 2 possible rings, and the extra 50% bonus from the Duskcrown ring, we won't be running out anytime soon. That's only half of the story, as Fire Tempest is still quite annoying to cast on its own. It takes forever and only lasts a relatively short duration. Spell swapping from Fire Surge is completely different. Not only does it give the expected quick startup, but because we're swapping to another Pyromancy, it allows us a continuous cast that is normally impossible with Fire Tempest. Asylum Demon is perhaps not the best demonstration of this power, though it does mark the start of an adventure that's sure to be plenty of fun. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that we can now actually move around while casting. It's not particularly fast, and it is hard to see anything past the Pillars of Fire, but there are plenty of early packs of enemies to try this out on. It'd take forever to show each encounter, so I'll try to sprinkle in the more interesting ones throughout the run. After clearing out more hollows than usual, we do finally find ourselves facing off against Taurus Demon. Even with the increased health, which capped back in New Game Plus 6, it's only a matter of time, and staggers, before we continue onwards. While the Hellkite Wyvern burns the top of the next bridge, we can burn the underside, including those pesky rats. Climbing back up a level, we find that boars are no good around fire, and the room before Gargoyles is ripe with AoE opportunities. As for the Gargoyles themselves, daggers are still our friend. It doesn't take too long or too many casts, as we have plenty to spare as we go to ring the first Bell of Awakening. Before heading to the other bell, however, we aim for the depths, meaning a stop in Lower Undead Burg. With all the pieces of our build already gathered, there aren't many skips in the run, but this is still an easy way down. Though the ladder to Out of Bounds was also very tempting. Deciding not to completely disable Capra's AI, we somehow tank a hit from a dog, and then fully leverage the high ground. Granted, that means there also isn't much to see, but rest assured, Fire Tempest did its job. Key in hand, we make it to the depths for the most satisfying stroll through the sewers I think I'll ever have. It's straight on to the next boss, though it probably would have been a good idea to take out the Channeler first. With a bit of extra danger from getting sniped from above, we take advantage of our mobility and follow Gaping Dragon as it makes its first charge. This gives more than enough time to use nearly half of our Fire Tempest casts. So often my runs rush the Lord Vessel, and thus the ability to warp, that it's a bit odd deciding to actually use the key to Blighttown. It takes a bit, but we get to the first bonfire, and eventually the second, before meeting a pivotal NPC of this entire run. We already have all the casts that we need, but Quelaag sells a bunch of pyromancies and gives access to Fire Tempest. Deciding to grab an extra copy for good measure, two things become apparent. First, dialogue can interrupt continuous casts. Second, which was already a bit obvious, she has some crazy high resistance to fire damage, and we can actually run out of Fire Tempest casts. This is solved with a bit of red tier stone bonus damage, but it is a bit concerning if we're already resorting to that. Unsurprisingly, Quelaag is not just resistant, but immune to fire damage. Similar to her previous run, we could use Black Flame to stick with pyromancies, or just admit she's not being fun and take her out with Dark Bead. This isn't truly a challenge run, but an exploration of Fire Tempest and what it can do. So it's best to move on, which has us ring the second Bell of Awakening, and climbing out of Blighttown to enter the now open Sen's Fortress. The trek is fairly uneventful, unless you count almost being sent back to the Undead Parish from an accidental jump, and we square off against the Iron Golem. While not completely intended, we do get the stagger off the bridge, though we also clearly had enough damage for a more traditional victory. All the bosses have been going quite smoothly so far, either being first try victories or maybe a silly reset not worth showing. but Ornstein and Smough had something to say about that. The plan was still fairly straightforward, but focusing one boss often led to another swooping in, and there was no chance of tanking any hits with that health bar on New Game Plus 11. A bit of patience, however, and the result is rather satisfying. Lord Vessel in hand, we might as well clear out the rest of Anor Londo, which means Gwyndolin is up next. While not traditionally a difficult fight, all of the teleporting is quite annoying while trying to spell swap. A time-consuming solution is to just wait out the not-so-endless hallway, or another solution is to just brute force it with a bit more damage using Red Tear Stone Ring again. Neither felt particularly satisfying, so I got a bit more practice challenging Gwyndolin than I expected. I found out you don't need to use any stamina dodging the piercing spells, and got fairly good at identifying the tiny pauses between spells that meant the arrow attack is next. This happens to be a great attack to punish regardless of what type of run you're doing. It takes 2 cycles, but I got fairly close to the run I was hoping for. With Gwyndolin gone, the Anor Londo Firekeeper is not very happy with us, but foolishly challenges us in a constrained hallway. Making sure to quickly end the dialogue, a Fire Tempest is free to do its job uninterrupted. The archives feel like a great next destination, though I again forget you need to actually place the Lord Vessel first for the golden fog walls to recede. Clearing that up, we find that boars still don't like fire, and neither do the crystal enemies. Though we will have to come through again later to pick up the DLC pendant that isn't dropped since we didn't progress that storyline. From here I contemplated doing another skip, but decided it'd be interesting to take on the Pisakas and the serpent enemies, which went about as expected. From there, it's another trek through the archives and the crystal caves, eventually reaching Seath. After breaking the immortality crystal, the best plan turned out to be getting Seath to spin. The less time Seath has to attack, the more time we have to summon Pillars of Fire. These same pillars aren't effective on Ceaseless, however, as again we have a fire immune boss. There's thankfully only 2 more immune bosses, and we'll be getting to them fairly shortly. In the meantime, Ceaseless has an easy cheese, and our way to the Demon Firesage is opened up. Despite having fire in the name, this sage is fortunately not immune, and the oh-so-familiar moveset has plenty of opportunities to accumulate damage from Fire Tempest. Centipede Demon is not so accommodating, being immune to fire damage, and so after a quick debate between the glitchy grab victory or just using Dark Bead it was. With the ability to now walk on lava, we can skip ahead to Lost Islith and our next interaction with a fellow Pyromancer. She's just as resilient as you'd imagine, though eventually decides to make a strategic retreat that honestly I'm fine with. It's at least more entertaining than our last fire immune boss that we'll just gloss over and give a good smack, just not with a Pyro Glove equipped. Getting back on track, we revisit the Asylum, clear out the Hollows, a Black Knight, Oscar, and one more Black Knight for the Peculiar Doll. We'll need that to enter the Painted World, but Stray Demon is patiently waiting. With less health than Firesage, the result is obvious, and the barbecue doesn't take too long. Within the Painted World, the intended route takes you through a room full of bone wheel skeletons that might have actually been interesting, or at least cathartic, but autopilot takes us on some magic geometry that allows us to skip all that and head straight to Priscilla. As the boss doesn't start hostile, it's fairly easy to prepare and not worry about failing a spell swap, though the opening dialogue does cause a misfire. Looking for footsteps, we just need to get another spell swap off and exploit a weakness so many bosses seem to share: walking slowly in circles. After some closing dialogue and another misfire, we're free of the painted world and are back to the Dark Root Garden. After the usual runaround of dodging projectiles, the fight against Moonlight Butterfly takes the usual turn once we can finally reach it. Not long after that, we can head a short ways over to the Great Grey Wolf. Seath is particularly agile, opting frequently to jump away from our AoE, but it doesn't take too long to get a clean run with a single cast. Seath's last jump was a bit nerve-wracking, but was too little too late with just one more fire pillar necessary to obtain the Covenant of Artorias. The Four Kings are bound to be difficult with their massive health pool, so instead of heading directly to the Abyss, we dive into the Catacombs, with all the usual shortcuts as we enter Pinwheel's domain. With each of our fire pillars taking out a quarter of Pinwheel's health, and the knockdown effect, it's a short fight. Though we are somehow staggered out of our attack, just too late for it to matter. As you'd expect, Gravelord Nito puts up a bit more of a fight, with his own ranged attacks and entourage of skeletons. Ignoring the general strategy of walking slowly in circles seems promising at first, but proves ill-advised as we don't win a DPS race and are robbed of a trade. This is easily rectified in the next attempt, as Nito and his various skeleton friends are no match for the sheer number of fire pillars we can summon. There's still one more Lord Soul to collect, but I feel the DLC calling, which means it's time to sidetrack to the Ulasil storyline. While I didn't go into the run with any real rules, it's probably evident at this point that casting spell swap once per fight, for a one-shot of sorts, has become an unofficial goal as we've progressed. The Hydra unfortunately doesn't mesh with that goal particularly well. While Fire Tempest is very good at cutting down its heads, we come up one short as we run out of casts. The damage from Red Tearstone Ring would surely solve the problem, but in this instance it felt more apt to swap multiple times and finally see a headless Hydra. This approach has a secondary benefit of preserving enough casts to also take on the following Golden Golem. From there, we can warp out and revisit our crystal friends in the archives for the key item to some of the hardest bosses in the game. With large health pools and more punishing attack patterns, we're sure to see some challenging fights that test the limits of our souped up Fire Tempest. Though, after hyping up the DLC, Sanctuary Guardian somehow manages to be the easiest boss of the run, with a cruel stun lock. Granted, it is the easiest boss of the DLC, but surely we won't get off so easy with the next few. As expected, Artorias does start to amp up the difficulty. This is one of my favorite fights, but usually that involves actually being able to dodge his attacks. Fire Tempest does stagger every other hit, but Artorias is fairly nimble and often manages to sneak a hit in somewhere. While the fight can clearly be done as is, after a few too many attempts to end in heartbreak, it feels like as good a time as any to really start to use RTSR strats. The direction of the fight goes much the same with the additional damage, but with less time to mess up or get a bad pattern, Artorias has no choice but to eventually let us through to Ulasil Township. From here we can take the real way down and make our way to Manus deep in the Abyss. I fully expect to use RTSR in this fight, but as a teaser, here's the damage we do without it. This is also where the timeline gets a bit complicated with some save file resetting, so instead of continuing on with Manus, we'll first open up the way to Kalameet and try our luck with the Black Dragon. Don't worry, we'll be back to Manus soon enough. Jumping into a room, we clear it out and pick up the crest key that a mimic was hiding. This allows us to have a chat with Goff, who lends us a hand at making sure we can actually fight Kalameet. I similarly expect to use RTSR here, and the damage without certainly shows why. While RTSR certainly helps, we end up boosting our damage even further with both the Bellowing Dragon Crest Ring and the Pyromancy Power Within. The latter comes at the expense of some health over time, putting us on a timer. However, the trade-off is more than worth it, even if Kalameet still finds ways to prolong the inevitable. Eventually we get what might be the perfect opening, allowing for plenty of uninterrupted casts, but positions us for what could be a very dangerous attack. Somehow it just pushes us aside and leaves Kalameet in range for a surprising and easy finish. This brings us back to our Manus attempts, where we're similarly going all out with RTSR, Dragon Crest, and Power Within. While this certainly gives us much more respectable damage, it's still difficult to get Manus to cooperate, though it clearly can be done. With enough attempts stacking up, however, it feels a fine time for our last bit of power creep. Excessively leveling Vitality, and equipping Havel's armor for good measure, an accidental jump instead of a roll throws a large chunk of the advantage out the window. The poise from the armor is our saving grace as we continue our cast, almost as if it were planned to enter RTSR range that way the entire time. It wasn't, but I'll take the trade as we head into the last two bosses of the run. Finally going for the remaining Lord Soul, we find ourselves back in the New Londo ruins. Instead of lowering the water as expected, it's easy enough to skip that entirely. I did try the 4 Kings before excessively leveling, but I'll spare you those attempts and go straight for the full power build right away. The main difference here is that we lose a ring slot to enter the Abyss and go back to the Dustcrown Ring to ensure we have enough casts for a long fight. This means no RTSR or Bellowing Dragoncrest Ring. While this is less damage, it also means more survivability. Someone with more patience, luck, and or skill could wait for multiple Kings to spawn and go for the single cast goal. But I'll save that for a future day. Instead, we'll go for 1 cast per King to whittle down their notoriously large health pool. Ultimately, the 4 Kings go much cleaner than expected, and while all that leveling might not have been necessary yet again, it was a great safety net. With all the Lord Souls in hand and all other bosses defeated, it's time to enter the Kiln of the First Flame and approach the Lord of Cinder. We've been here plenty of times before, and it's almost tradition to parry. There will be no riposte this time around, but all we need is that one opening for our last cast of Fire Tempest. This was a fun run. It explored yet another aspect of spell swap in Dark Souls, and I'm glad I got to share it with you all. If you enjoyed it too, consider subscribing or checking out another video. Until next time, take care.